Thank you, Asawari, for those kind words of introduction. You certainly managed to make me feel older than or as old as I am. 4 decades of experience. It doesn't feel true, but that's what it is. Thank you also, I think, to Anil and Bhushan for their remarks at the beginning. It gives me a sense of how significant today is. I hadn't realized this was the 60th Diamond Jubilee event of OPPI, and I know it's a flagship event in your calendar every year, but I am delighted and feel enormously privileged that I have the opportunity to be here with all of you on this very special day. I also got a chance to listen to the incredible contribution that you have made over the last 60 years and sense the desire to keep making even a bigger contribution as India seeks to progress and achieve its Viksit Bharat ambition and the role that all of you have to play. So for all of these reasons, I feel incredibly proud and privileged to be here today. Now, I also realize that it's a day when you're going to be celebrating many of your achievements, successes across the business, and I guess celebrate you must. So I'm going to try and keep my talk as short as possible so that I don't come in the way of you and what you've really come here for. Now, when Bhushan asked me whether I would come here, I readily agreed, I must say. But after agreeing, I did have some questions on my mind as to what is it that I'm going to speak to an audience like this. Clearly, I can't be talking about the pharma industry and trying to give you some deep insights about it because, let's face it, all of you have probably forgotten more than I'll ever manage to learn. Yeah? So that can't be what I talk about. So I then decided that I'd speak to something that I have a personal experience in. Insights that I've got of Unilever's journey in India, a journey that spans over almost 100 years that it's been in this country, and try and distill a few lessons, a few insights that has enabled this company to be a successful and a formidable player in India. And having done that, I leave it to you. I leave it to you to see if there are any parallels out of what I say which might apply to the pharma industry as you find yourselves at this stage. Yeah? So that's really what I'm going to do. Now, as I talk about Unilever and HUL, I must absolutely and unashamedly say that I'm biased. So I will say it the way I feel it, so take it with in that spirit. Now, when I look back at why Unilever has succeeded over these years, and if there was the one thing that I would begin by calling out, is what I would say the power of conviction. Conviction before the opportunity becomes obvious. Conviction well before that. Now, I mentioned a short while ago that the company came to India about 100 years ago, when the last thing that you would think of was having conviction about India. It was far from obvious. Because let's face it, 100 years ago when people came in, all that existed was a large population, but a population with no purchasing power, which meant the market in theory but not in reality. The business environment which existed was tough. It wasn't conducive. Not just when we entered, but for several decades after that, the business environment was hardly conducive. And yet, the company committed. Yet there was this strange conviction that this country can be a very sizable part of Unilever and we can build a very strong business out here. This sort of conviction is rare because it requires you to invest. And having conviction is important, but conviction alone is not enough unless you do something about it. Unless you have the willingness to invest, unless you have the willingness to create a market and not just wait for the market to develop. And that brings me to the second theme that I want to talk about, which is if you want to create a market, the one imperative is the need to build local relevance. It might sound obvious. It might sound absolutely obvious that you cannot rely and you cannot assume that Western products, Western price point, Western business models, Western assumptions can simply be brought here and made to work. And yet, obvious as it sounds, there are far too many companies that I've seen over the last few decades which assume this to be the case, and that's why I'm calling this out. Now, it is to the credit of many people who came in this company decades ago, most of them British expatriates at that time, who realized that we would not be able to build a business by simply importing Western assumptions, Western models. But realizing this is part of the solution, but then recognizing what would be needed. If we had to build products offering price points, business systems for India, you needed Indian talent. Why? Because you needed someone who understood the complexity of India, the diversity of India, the many paradoxes of India. Someone who could be deeply in tune with the cultural ethos of India. Without that, you didn't stand a chance. And if you needed that, you needed local talent, like I said. But where would that talent didn't exist 5-6 decades ago? There were no business schools around. And that meant that the company had to go around scouting for young, bright, talented individuals with no background, but bring them in and start training them. And if today this company has built a reputation of being a leadership factory, it is only because somebody several decades ago started on this journey and almost made it a part of the DNA of this organization. In fact, this conviction was so strong that you won't believe it. In 1961, 4 years before the OPPI came into existence, the five, the first Indian chairman was appointed. And since then, in the last 65 odd years, other than a 2-year period in between, every single person who's run the country has been an Indian who's been around. So that just gives you a sense of how deep the commitment was to talent, but the recognition that unless you build local relevance, you are unlikely to succeed in this place. Now, that was the second point I wanted to make. There's a third point I wanted to mention, which is about innovation. Innovation is a big theme that I heard just now. And you know what? Our realization has been that innovation is much more than product. We need to innovate on our business models. We need to innovate on, in fact, I would go on to say that while HUL has brought many impressive products to this country, probably its best innovation, or most significant innovation, has been the way it has learned to make money in a country like India. Because that is not easy. When you are addressing the Indian consumer at the price points which are required, it is clear that you can't have models which existed in the past. It is clear that your margin structure is likely to be compromised. Because we first started off with what can the consumer pay, and then worked backwards to solve for everything else. Innovating on costs, innovating on our supply chain, being absolutely relentless, and in terms of business models. In the late 80s, early 90s, I just joined the company. I could not imagine how when we were forced with our back to the wall, we had launched a product which was Wheel, and our margins at that stage, our operating margins would have been in low single digits. Now, how do you run a business like that? And yet, the company figured out a way to make exceptional shareholder return while making low single digit operating margins. Why? Because we found a way to do this with virtually zero capital. Negative working capital, zero fixed capital allowed us to run this business, creating mathematically an infinite return. An infinite return with running a business at those low margins. Something unthinkable in a Western context which we were around. But it required a very, very different mindset. And the fourth lesson, and the last one which I talk about, is what I would call resilience and the absolute discipline to do the right thing always. Resilience is relatively straightforward, because if you have to operate in India, and all of you who have been doing that, you would realize that the journey is never linear in a country like ours. I often say it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and in bad times it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. That's how the journey has been. And therefore it requires belief. It requires conviction that the secular outcomes will be positive and moving in the right direction. And it requires the capacity to stay the course in bad times, in difficult moments. Yeah? That's resilience. But it also requires the discipline to always do the right things. I can go back in my history and think of numerous occasions when the temptation to take shortcuts would have been very high. Many temptations. And not doing so meant a short-term cost. It meant delays, it meant frustration, it meant assets lying idle, it meant a factory remaining uncommissioned for months. Why? Because somebody expected speed money for that last connection or approval letter which had to come. And we said, we simply won't do that. And I think those decisions taken by my predecessors many years ago have paid us back, because in the end, we won grudging respect, reputation, and over a period of time we learned that reputation compounds, integrity compounds, trust compounds, and the benefits of that you see over a period of time. So those were some of the lessons that I think, nothing to do with me, all of these leaders who've preceded me came in and have put in place, as a result of which some of us got the opportunity to keep building and making this company what it is just now. Now I say all of this, I started right up front saying I'm going to share some of this. I'm not sure how much of it is going to be relevant to any of you. But maybe some of it is, maybe if it is not, and I'll leave it to you. But I'm going to move on to say a few words about the pharma industry as I see it. In fact, I have to say, when I started working in the late 80s, before that actually, I must say, like Unilever, many of the companies in this room were relatively early entrants into India. And when I started working, probably the entire market was dominated by companies in this room. Shares, probably over 80-90% of the share of this industry was made up of global multinational pharma companies who were here. As I say a few things, it might sound provocative, and if I say something which some of you find offensive, I apologize up front. It is only in the spirit of trying to encourage you to think of the next 60 years a little differently. So, you were early entrants, but I suspect, and as an outsider, the lens with which many companies happened to see India was somewhat cautious. Probably for good reason, I can only surmise what those were. Probably seeing India as a large population but limited ability to pay. Probably seeing India as a complex regulatory environment. Probably being somewhat concerned of some of the business practices that were in place at that point in time. And probably because each of these companies had more attractive, easier to address markets elsewhere in the world. And probably a combination of all of this meant that these companies, all of your companies who were here early and had built a sizable presence out here, were somewhat cautious and waited for conditions to get a little better, where they could feel a little more comfortable doing business out here. And it is in that period some other companies saw an opportunity. Many domestic Indian companies came of age at that point in time, and over the last 2 or 3 decades, they built scale. They captured market share. They shaped an ecosystem in that period. And from a situation where companies here were occupying or had probably 80, 90% share of the market, today, I think it's somewhere down in the mid-teens. That's quite a significant erosion, we have to agree. And the question really that each one of us has to ask ourselves is, what is preventing global pharma companies to committing more wholeheartedly to India? Is it that we are still evaluating India with an outdated lens? Because the India of today is very different from the India of 20 or 30 years ago. India is growing. Affluence is increasing. Healthcare awareness is going up. Systems are getting stronger. Standards are getting better, are evolving. And even more importantly, there is little doubt in most people's mind that the next decade or two will be of countries like India in the world. So, if we are not committing to this opportunity, it is less to do with the market, in my view, but more to do with our mindset and our willingness to embrace the fact that addressing this will require a somewhat different approach, a different business model, and that's not always comfortable. Why? Because if we have to address this market, it will mean the willingness to accept that our price points here will be somewhat different from the rest of the world. It will mean that we will have to find models which will create value differently from what they have created elsewhere. It doesn't mean that we have to accept lower value creation or lower returns from here, but the way it has to be done and the way it can be done will be different. And that's not easy. That's an uncomfortable thought for many of us. Therefore, I'm going to give you just one example, and I can understand that discomfort. I have dealt with it and I've seen it. I remember the time when in HUL, the first shampoo sachet was planned to be launched. That sachet, 1 rupee, we still sell some sachets for 1 rupee. Imagine, 1 rupee is $1 cent. Yeah? Imagine 100 such sachets to be given in $1. And imagine trying to explain to a Western mindset that we're going to sell it for 1 cent. And in 1 cent, you have to bear the cost of the product, the cost of the packaging, the distribution across the length and breadth of this country, the taxes that you have to pay to the government, the margins to the distributor, the margins to the retailer, and yet have something out of this 1 cent left to yourself to make some money out of it. This is absurd, is what people would say. And yet it was possible. It was possible once you started thinking about it and relentlessly innovated. And that's why I started saying that innovation is much more than product. In this country, to succeed, innovation has to be thought of more holistically across the value chain to be able to create value in this state. Now, which brings me back to all of us once again. What is the role that each one of us has got at this moment? The leadership teams of these companies, all of you sitting in this room, you have an incredible opportunity and a responsibility. And your responsibility is not just to run your India businesses. Your responsibility is to reframe. It is to interpret India differently for the rest of the world. That's your responsibility. It is to help global headquarters see India through a different lens. A lens which will suddenly show opportunity rather than all the problems which are there. It's a question of what lens you use. That's your responsibility. It is a responsibility to build conviction where there might be some skepticism. It is a responsibility to demonstrate that different business models can exist which can create value. That it is possible to run a business with seemingly different margins and yet create exceptional returns. That's your responsibility. And you know what? You are blessed. You're blessed because you're in an industry where it is still not too late. In other industries, if you were sitting at a cumulative share of about 15%, you would say probably the train has left the station. It is very, very difficult to claw back. But not so here, because the innovation intensity of this industry is such that it is possible to claw back. And why do I say that? Just take the recent success of Mounjaro. In a short period of time, for Mounjaro to become the number one, similar to Augmentin in this country, what does it say? It says when you come up with something, you get the pricing, you get the model right, this opportunity exists. And that's really the calling for each one of you. So I'm going to end with only one last thought for all of you, which is don't wait. Don't wait for India to become a market that you will be comfortable with. Build the capabilities to succeed in the India that actually exists today. Because the future belongs to those who will do this. I wish you all the best. I wish you much success. And I wish you the opportunity to create the India that you deserve and the India that all of us want. Thank you.